Get home. All right, good evening. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are toward the bottom, Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Beis, about 8 or 9 lines from the bottom. And we're going to do similarly, we're going to stop similarly on the bottom of Kuf Mem Ches Amud Beis. Part of this is easy, part of this is challenging. Either way, we're going to make our way through it. Says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, Shchiv Meira Sha'amar. We know, of course, we've been learning about a matnas Shchiv Meira, unique halacha, that when a Shchiv Meira is on his deathbed and he says something, it's binding. But it's not always binding. And here's one of the exceptions. If a person says, Shchiv Meira Sha'amar, Yadur beploni bayis zeh, or Yochal ploni, peros dekel zeh, if I say, I need you to live in this particular house, I'm not giving you the house, I want you to live there. So it's not about kinyanim. I'm telling you where to live. I'm giving you a directive, or I want you to eat from this peros dekel. The halacha is lo amar klum ad she'omar tnu ba'izeh ploni. You have to gift it to him, or v'yadur bo, or tnu dekel zeh ploni v'yochal peros. So this is a qualification on the din of a matnas shchiv meira. A shchiv meira doesn't get the power to do whatever in the world he wishes. What he's allowed to do is to be makneh something verbally, which is a chiddush. We spoke yesterday about whether or not that's a din d'oraisa or a din d'rabbanan. But the Gemara wants to know over here whether or not he's allowed to tell someone where to live or that you should be eating food from this peros dekel. Says the Gemara, no. And Lememra says the Gemara, does that mean the Sabar of Nachman, Milsa de Isa bebari Isa b'shchiv meira, to Lessa bebari Lessa b'shchiv meira, that the rules of a bari and a shchiv meira are aligned? That can't be, because last line of Kuf Mem Zayin, Amud Beis Amar Rava, Amar Rav Nachman, turning to the top of Kuf Mem Ches Amud Aleph. Shchiv meira Amar Tnu halva asi leploni, halva asi leploni. A shchiv meira who says that they should give. Actually, the Gemara, the Rishonim here take this out. It doesn't say Tnu. Shchiv meira she'amar halva asi leploni. My loan is for someone else. Then the halacha is halva asi leploni. That works. And that's binding. V'afal gav delese bebari, and that would not be true by a bari. This is a halacha called milve al peh, and a milve al peh generally is not binding unless you're a shchiv meira. And Rav Papa, so this is a shtickle stira because it seemed to be from the original presentation that the halacha was by a shchiv meira have to be similar to that of a bari, and then this brisa seemed to not say that way. So the Gemara says Rav Papa Amar hoel v'yoresh yorsha. It's different when you're talking about a yoresh. That the case of halvasi leploni, when he says that, that's different for yoresh. Rav Acha Rav Ika Amar, he gave another answer, halva ise bebari. He says that there is also this din of halva by a bari as well. We had this idea where verbally a loan can transfer hands. That's something that we've seen numerous times in Shas and a couple of days ago, where we have this principle of Ma'amad Shlashtan that has nothing to do with Matnas Shchiv Meira. That has to do with the din of a bari. So perhaps that we're really concluding that there has to be a precedence in the world of bari, in cases where we say that a Shchiv Meira should otherwise have some latitude. All of that is sugya number 1 for the day, which is a possible qualification on the scope and limit of the power of a Matnas Shchiv Meira. The Gemara asks a very subtle question. Dekel le'echad. Let's say the matnas shchiv meira says this tree goes to person 1. Upeirotzav le'acher, and the peiros go to another person. Mahu. What's the halacha? Mi shiur makom peire, olo shiur. Do we assume that the place where the actual fruits grow out from still belong to the shchiv meira, or do they not? Not the tree, not the whole tree at least, and not the peiros, but the place where they grow out of. What? Well, it could just be this round of fruits goes to that person. Maybe it's not everyone. He's giving away what exists right now. Could be. So the Gemara says almost halfway down on Kuf Mem Ches Amud Aleph, Im Timtza Lomar that la'acher. Oh, sorry, I skipped the line. Oh, no. Im Timtza Lomar la'acher lo have shiur. If you want to say that because there was an acher involved, like that the shchiv meira gave to one person, and he gave the peiros to another, so therefore lo have a shiur. So then the way this should read is shiur la'atmo mahu. What if he taka did earmark just for himself? And really, when it comes to the fact that he gave to an acher, he gave to a second party, so therefore he gets nothing. What if he did earmark just for himself? So Amar Rava, Amar Rab Nachman, Im Timtza Lomar dekel le'echad u'feirosav la'acher. If you want to say, like we started out this case, that the dekel went to one person and the peros went to another lo havashir, and makom peri dekel leechad b'shir peros of lefanav shir makom piri, we would in fact say that if he left the dekel over to one person and he was mishar the peros to another and he left himself a makom peri, if he expressly said that, we would say that yes, it is his. Unlike the inference case from the Ibayla who 8 lines down, no, that case is not like this. This case was more explicit. Why would that be true? My timer. So the Gemara answers with a halachic truth and a human psychology. Kol legabe nafshe be'ayin yafe mishayer. Whenever a person is making a deal and they're factoring themselves in, they usually factor themselves in a meaningful way. So that is what the Gemara says over here, and we're going to actually learn the same idea from another Mari Makom. Amar le Rababa le Rabashi. Anan, where did we learn this idea from? That that we don't say that there's a shiur, that there's a leftover for the shchiv meirah when an acher is involved. He says, Anan, we learned that ad Reb Shimon ben Lakish masnin Allah. We learned that from Rish Lakish. The Amar Reb Shimon ben Lakish, a Gemara that we saw earlier in this Masechta. A mocher bais lechaveiro, a man sells a house to his friend. V'amar lo, I'm selling you my house. Almanasha diuta ha'elyona shali, that the upper portico, whatever's up on the porch on the roof, is mine. So the halacha is that his preclusion to the sale works. Diuta ha'elyona shalo. Then in fact, he does earn and keep the upper diuta, the upper little porch that's on the roof. So that's what happens if I sell my house and I say, I want to sell it to you, but the little portico on the roof remains mine. No problem, it remains mine. Turning to the top of Kuf Mem Chesim at base, and we'll be learning until about 8 or 9 lines to the bottom of the page. Ibaylahu. Well, let's ask a kasha in this case of the diuta. Says the Gemara, Bais le'echad, the diuta le'echad. Let's say that a shchiv meirah. Let's say that somebody gives the house to one person and he gives a diuta to another one. Ma'u, me have a shiur or lo. Would we say that there was something left over in the sale? And this is subtle. We wouldn't have seen this from the Gemara. We need the Rishonim for this, and we need earlier sugyas that we've learned, because the diuta was some kind of portico where you can like kind of overhang some beams out into the public space. So that's what we're talking about, is this extra space. And the Gemara wants to know, was there such a shiur left over, yes or no? And imtim tzalomar bais le'echad v'diuta le'echad lo have a shiur. And if in fact it would be the case that there would be no shiur, no leftover for the balabas, in the event that the person, that the sale was that the diuta would go to a separate person. Okay, well, what if the language was chutz mediuta? What if the language of in the sale was one person gets the house and another person gets the diuta? Or I'm selling everything except the diuta. Mahu, would we say that the space just outside the diuta belongs to the homeowner? Yes or no? So Amar Rav Nachman, imtim tzalomar bais le'echad v'diuta le'echad lo have a shiur. What would be the case? Rabbi says in Rabbi Nachman that if you want to say that the person sold a bias to one person and diuta to another, that would not be a shiur. Chutz diuta have a shiur. We would assume that if the language was chutz midiuta, that the homeowner would still maintain the right to the airspace surrounding the diuta. And this would be V'aliba de Rav Zvid, first of the long lines. This would be in accordance with the opinion of Rav Zvid de Omar. He says, Shim Ratza lahosi bazizin moti. Oh, this is an explicit shita of Rav Zvid that makes perfect sense, which is that protrusions from the diuta are allowed. Alma, kevin the shir diuta, makom zizin nami shir. That since he had this language of chutz midiuta, he is then able to have zizin, to have protrusions stick out from the diuta, which is a raya that there was a shiur when he said chutz midiuta. So that's how we see that when a person makes a sale and they say chutz midiuta, that he maintains certain unique aspects of the property. That's what the Gemara says, and it brings us up to the parentheses, 8 lines down. Skip the parentheses, and let's move on to the next case. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Yosef bar Minyumi, Amar Rav Nachman. He says the following case: Shchiv meirah, a man is on his deathbed. Shekasav, he writes down kol nechasav le'acherim. He writes down on a piece of paper, a little capital, he writes down a little something, and he says, Kol nechasav le'acherim. He writes everything away. So Rowan, then we have to take a look. Im b'mechalek, if he's trying to get rid of all of his property, so then if mace kanukulan, if in fact he ends up dying, then you're right. then his ksiva of kol nechasav la'acherim is chal, and all of his property is gone. However, Ahmad, if he heals, so the person's on his deathbed, he takes a piece of paper and he says, Kol nechasai le'achem, he writes that down. So then if he's up, but now he's better, miraculous, they gave him whatever treatment, now he's alive. Ahmad, chozer bechulan, then everything goes back to him because obviously he was selling it only with the havamina that he was going to die. So that's what the Gemara means, 4 or 5 lines into the wide lines where it says Ahmad, that if he gets healed, chozer bechulan. Now, im benimlach, if he changes his mind, so he starts talking, he says, I want to give Gerald this much. And he says, you know what? I don't think I want to do that. Or he just changes his mind in any area. If at that point, mace, that the person dies, kanu kulan, then the halacha is that all of the things that he in fact said work. But amad, if in fact he is healed after changing his mind, so he's kind of stuttering a little bit. First he says, I wanted to go to this one, then he says, I wanted to go to that one. So then the halacha is, Eino chozer ele be'achron. We only are chozer on the last one. We assume that the first one is chal, and when he paused and started rethinking and reallocating, so that was a change in gears. But the last one is not chal, because that was the matnas shchimera. Says the Gemara, v'dilma iyune kame'ayin v'hadar yahib. Maybe he paused in the middle and said, I want to give some to Gerald. You know what? Let me think about it, and then I'll give some to Tex. So the Gemara says, no. When it comes to a shchimera who is about to die, he has clarity on what he is planning on giving away. It's not the first time he's thought of it. People don't just think about these things al regal achas right before they die. So therefore, if in fact there was a pause, then the first time that he was giving something away, that was a proper matana, and then he paused. After that, that was a matna shchimera, and therefore he's chozer ba'achron if the guy is amad, if he heals, because obviously wasn't his intention. So that's how we're mechalek between the first part of his idea, which we say is a regular matana, which is not chozer, that's binding, and the second part of his matana, which is able to be returned. That brings us to the one dot of Amar of Achabar Menyumi, 6 lines into the wide lines. One more challenging sugya, and then we will call it a day for today. Daf Kuf Mem Chesem Beis, a third of the way down. Amar of Achabar Menyumi, Amar of Nachman. Shchiv Meira, Shekasav Kol Nechasav Le'acherim. A Shchiv Meira writes down that he wants to give away all of his properties. V'amad, and he heals, he gets better. So he was about to die, now he's healed. Eino chozer. He wrote it down. We're not going to let him go back. If he was verbal, if he had said verbally, I want to give everything away, we'd allow him to be chozer. That's built in, it's baked into the fabric of a matnas shchimera. But when there's a ksiva, the halacha is different. Eino chozer. Why? Chayshinan shemiyesh lo nechasim b'medina acheres. A fascinating concern. The reason why we are not choshesh is because maybe he has more properties, and therefore this sale wasn't really a proper full shchiv meira sale. Says the Gemara, if you're concerned that he always has other properties, then we have a problem with some fundamental mar makomos. Says the Gemara of Elamas Nisan, but our Mishnah, which says Iktani lo shiur karka kolshu ein matnaso kayemes, that if a person doesn't have any karka at all, then his matana is not kept. What is this case of lo shiur karka kolshu? Maybe he always has other properties. So here we have a couple of possible answers. Amar Reb Chama be'omer kol nechasai, where he says, I'm giving away everything, which obviously includes all fields, even the ones that I haven't explicitly mentioned. Or another possibility is Mar Baravashi Amar b'muchzak lon b'lesba, where there's a chazaka that this person taka doesn't have any other properties. Halfway down, the Gemara says, Yibayaluhu, we have a kasha. Chazra b'miktzas have chazara b'kula. Olo. If a person is chozer on what he said to any one person, so let's say I give a person, let's say a shchiv meira gives a person, I have $100,000, text, here you go, this is for you. And before anything else happens, he says that one sentence, and then he changes, you know what, I only want to give you $60,000. So what happens? Do we consider his chazara to lower it from 100 to 60? Is that a chazara, or is it not a chazara?
Did we discuss if there's a chashash from the other side that he's so delirious that he doesn't know what he's saying as it should?
Yeah, we spoke about that concern yesterday. That was a concern that came up as a possibility. And that's why there were some shitas that said, if you look on the top of Kuf Mem Zayin Amud Beis, that was a concern. The Matnas Shchimera has to be Derabanan because it could be Shema Tatarev died to Alav. It could be that maybe he's lost his marbles. He's not thinking straight. So the Chachamim instituted that Afal Pi, that it's possible that he's not himself, we still trust him. The Din Derabanan, it's an override. Unless you know he's delirious. But if somebody, you can tell. Text, I want you to take my piano. That you can tell. You can tell what's happening. But if they're incoherent, if they're swallowing their own words, okay, you can tell. But the din derabanan of, okay, this according to this approach in the Amoraim, this machlokes in the Amoraim, if the matnas shchimir is a din deraisa or din derabanan. But according to the approach that is derabanan, it's on the point that you're raising, which is that not everybody's so lucid in the last moments of their life, the last hours of that, everybody's so clear. So yeah, that is a concern. That is a concern. So that's what our Gemara wants to know now. We're about halfway down on Kuf Mem Ches Amud Beis, that if a person was chozer b'miktsas, is that a chazara b'kula or no? Does that undo everything? So if I change Texas Yerusha from 100 to 60, does that mean he gets 60 or does that mean it's 0? Just obviously, clearly the Shchimer didn't know what he was talking about. So says the Gemara, Toshma. Let's see. Kul on the Rishon, if he says, I want everything to go to the first person, and then he retracts and he says, Umiktsas on the Sheni, actually, I'd like a little bit to go to the second person. Look at this. Sheni Kana, Rishon lo Kana. That means that we're choser entirely. So the Gemara says that's why we were, and we're gonna discuss it more now. But the Gemara was looking at that original thing. So 100,000 to text, and then we say, you know what, only 40,000 to text, or only 60,000 to text and 40,000 to Gerald. So the halacha is that Gerald's 40,000 is binding, and he keeps it, but text gets nothing, because now what we've seen is a revelation that the original giving of 100 was not real. He changed his mind.
Why couldn't you just say it was an amendment?
Why couldn't you say what?
It's an amendment. It's not a.
So let's learn the Gemara. This is what the Brisa says, that Sheni Kana Rishon Lo Kana. My La B'Shemes. Is this talking about a case where the Shchiv Meira died? So says the Gemara, Lo B'Sha'amad. This is where the guy is alive. He got healed. So now let's talk this case out. There's a Shchiv Meira. He said 100,000 to Tex. And then he said, you know what, 60,000 to Tex and 40,000 to Gerald. And then he got healed. So remember, he had two stages here. The 100,000 he retracted from. That he retracted. And the remainder that he wanted to give to Tex is binding. And Hachanami Mistaber, that we're talking about a person who healed, although this is a side point, Midikatani Seifa, because it says later in the Brisa, and this brisa can be found in Nedarim, that miktsasan lerishon, if he wanted to give a little bit to the first person, and then he changed his mind and said v'chula on the sheni, then rishon kana. So that's because that he already had fully given over the money. The first person gets in sheni lo kana because he was alive. But that's the opposite version of what we said in the Resha. In the Resha, we said that he had given over everything to the first person and then recanted. So that's why we have this distinction. It must be a kesha amad. Iyam amris bishlama bisha amad. If you want to say that the guy was alive, mishum hachi sheni lo kana, that in the Resha, the second person was not kona. Elai amris bishemes. If you want to say that the person died, well, then it should be a regular matnas shchimera. It should be tarvayu liknu. Elamai. It must be that we're talking about a case of amad. And says the Gemara furthering on this point, Amar le Rav Yemar le Rav Ashi, v'tehave nami b'shamar. I can prove my point that Chazar b'mixas is a Chazara, even in a case of Amad. Iyamris b'shlama Chazar b'mixas havya Chazara b'kula. If you want to say this person is b'shamad, he's alive now. If you want to say that when he is Chozer a little bit from what he said, he's Chozer b'kula, hainu desheni mihaskana. That's why we could say that the second person is still Konen, because Chazar on the first guy was a proper Chazar, which means that whatever he said about the second guy is still true. If you want to say that the Chazar b'mixas wasn't a proper Chazar, It should be like he's being mechalek, like he tried to give everything out and now he's still alive. And no one should get anything because we said that when someone heals after trying to be mechalek their nechasim, this was what we saw toward the top of the page, then no one would be kona anything. So how, in fact, do we paskin in this regard? The Gemara says, and this is quoted in Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat, and it discusses this, L'maisa b'helchosa, chazar b'mixas havya chazar b'kula. It's unbelievable, and it is a difficult din to understand. But the Gemara says that if a shchiv meira makes a commitment to someone, and he's chozer b'mixas, it's a 0 for that first person, and it's a kinyan for the second. That's how we paskin. And in the Reisha, in the first case of the brisa that we saw above, mishkachas la ben shemeis ben sha'amad, doesn't matter if he lives or dies. The math would all work out that we see that this principle of chazar b'mixas is a chazara. And in the Seifa, it wouldn't work in both cases. Lo mishkachas la ela b'sha'amad, the only ela kishamad, it would only be true if he was amad. Then we would see the application of this din of chazar b'mixas, havya chazar b'kula. The mice, everyone should be very careful to write a very clear will and testament, and it should be a matana before they die instead of getting into Yerusha stuff. It's so complicated. These are the things that are halachos and chumash. We really try to avoid them. The only time it really comes up is when someone's not responsible and they don't write a will, or if someone dies young and they have assets. So then it's next of kin based on all the principles we've been learning over the last 150 blot. We start with the sons. If not the sons, we start with the daughters. Then we go up to the father's brothers. They get the home. That's a home. So we would definitely want to try and do that. So we'll stop right here in Mirz Hashem. Tomorrow we will learn Daf Kuf Mem Tes and as well Daf Kuf Nun Amud Aleph. That's Thursday night. Shabbos, the next 2 Shabbos, I'm not going to be here. And Baruch Hashem for Simchas. And all right, we're good for tonight. We'll stop right here. Wishing you all a beautiful night.